Hi, Dustin.
Ian, how you doing today?
I'm good, thank you. How are you? How's the Twin Cities?
Not too bad. It's cold, as always, around this time of year, but things are good otherwise.
Who knew?
Well, Ian, let's talk a bit about your new book here, Smash, Green Day, The Offspring, Bad Religion, NOFX, and the 90s punk explosion. What are the listeners in for with the new book?
Well, as readers might be able to tell from that snappy title, basically I've had the idea of the book for quite a long time, and originally it was going to be just set in the year 1994, which was the year older listeners might remember was the year that the two punk rock bands broke into the mainstream. These being Green Day, who did so with the album Dookie, and The Offspring, who released the album Smash. Both of these albums were each group's third full-length releases. The Offspring did this on an independent record label, which was truly remarkable. And suddenly, The Offspring and Green Day and other bands too, NOFX, Rancid, Bad Religion, were on MTV. And because this had sort of happened in the years subsequent to the alternative nation revolution of Nirvana and Pearl Jam and all of these bands, it perhaps didn't seem that necessarily remarkable. But part of the reason for telling this story is that all of the bands that I write about, all of these bands are still together as well, it's worth mentioning, identified themselves as being punk rock bands, which Nirvana didn't necessarily, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, Jane's Addiction, all of these previous bands didn't, although they were clearly influenced by punk, both in their ideology and their music, they weren't as such punk rock bands. And prior to Green Day and The Offspring, it's worth remembering that no punk rock band had ever been successful in the United States. The Ramones didn't crack the US Billboard Hot 100 with any of their albums. They toured in a van. Even the Twin Cities' Magnificent Replacements, despite being critically lauded, and Husker Du, despite being critically lauded, never sold any records. So this was a first, and I didn't think that the story really had been given the credit, certainly in book form, that it deserved. So that was basically what I was trying to do.
Yeah, it definitely was an interesting time. I was in high school then, and even kids that were listening to, Michael Jackson and New Kids on the Block and whatever, suddenly they were buying, Green Day and Offspring albums.
Yeah, it was crazy. I mean, and it sounds like I'm slightly older than you, Dustin. I'm in my mid-40s. So I was, and I just started my what I laughingly refer to as my career as a music journalist. And so I knew all of this music. I'd seen The Offspring supporting NOFX at a tiny club that was half full here in North London. And I wrote one of the earlier first articles I wrote as a professional music journalist. I wrote about American punk rock. And my prognosis, my conclusion was that American punk rock was dead. This was in 1993, and I suspect, just to spite me, Green Day and The Offspring released Dookie and Smash respectively, and proved me wrong to a laughable degree. So even sort of people who were supposedly paying attention, including those in the bands, I don't think were expecting what was happening. Certainly, of all the bands that became popular, Green Day were the only ones that did so on a major label. Green Day did so on Warner Brothers. And this is worth mentioning, A, because it was a really big deal at the time for a punk band to sign to a major. Green Day, caught a lot of flack for that. But it's also worth mentioning because Green Day were the only band that the major labels went after. None of the other punk rock bands were courted by major labels. So it really was kind of this most miraculous of accidents, really. And even though many of the people concerned became millionaires and multimillionaires, I think it's still fair to look at them as being sort of the underdogs, really. And I think that's quite an interesting part of what happened, too.
Well, do you think some of these bands struggled with, wanting to be punk rock, but also being successful? I know some people feel like you can't have both.
Yeah, I think yes, I think that they did. The Offspring did go on to sign to a major label, but did so after becoming, rock stars, really punk rock stars on an independent label. I think a lot of bands did feel guilty, and even to this day, I mean, for the book, I interviewed basically everyone concerned, and even today, they all speak of, the decision to sign with major labels. If not with a measure of defensiveness, at least with the understanding that this was sort of significant in a way that it wouldn't have been for a metal band or for a country, alternative country band or some such. There was, it was significant. Funnily enough, it's quite a happy story that I tell. Essentially, that some of the people go to jail briefly and end up, addicted to drugs, but everybody comes through the other side. So it's not like sort of the tale of Seattle, where, the guilt and bewilderment felt by Kurt Cobain caused him to take his own life, really. This was life-threatening stuff. So success on such a scale to an independently minded punk rocker could be terrifying. And in that context, I think it's quite remarkable how well everyone featured in the book really dealt with what happened to them.
Well, and you mentioned thinking the punk rock scene was dead once before. Is it safe to say it probably is dead now? With the death of Warped Tour and all that sort of thing, it seems like maybe it's over.
Yeah, I think it would be. I think it would be unwise to count it out. There are some terrific young punk rock bands at the moment. I'd point your listeners toward two in particular, both from Los Angeles, actually. The Interrupters are particularly good, and as are Culture Abuse. So they're two groups that are around and are making things happening. I think what the issue you raised, Dustin, is sort of indicative of music as a whole. Music. Certainly guitar music is no longer at the vanguard of culture really anymore, because there's just so much other stuff. So people who might otherwise have picked up a guitar and with a head full of snot and melody would have got themselves noticed that way or expressed themselves that way, now have a myriad of other outlets through which to do so. They can vlog. They can blog, they can podcast, they can, there are all sorts of ways. So music isn't necessarily the default setting for the malcontent anymore, really. And I think that needs to be considered. But, as Bob Dylan said, don't speak too soon because the wheel's still in spin.
Excellent. Well, again, Smash is out now, and Ian Winwood, I know you've got a lot of other stuff you've done and probably working on something soon, so we'll be looking out for you.
I look forward to that, Dustin, and I hope you don't freeze to death there in the Twin Cities.
We're come from a hardy stock here, so I think we'll be all right.
Yes, you would need to.
All right, thanks a lot, Ian.
Thanks, Dustin.
All right, bye-bye.